So we're back to this thing, right? So this session's about getting better at achieving predictable outcomes, right? In short, and hopefully you're going to get these ideas will be relevant whether you're working in a small shop or an agency or on an enterprise team. I think it's all pretty much the same. Really, the essence of what it is that I want to cover isn't specific to software, right? It's more in estimation. And I think one of the problems is I tried to survey the topic of software estimation. I found that there was a lot of material that's about, hi, come on in. Yes, welcome. We're just getting started. There's pizza in the back. There's stuff in the fridge to drink. The conversation tends to focus on process issues, is what you find in the literature, right? They say it's a book about estimation, but it's really a book about software process. And we overlook the fact that there's been a lot of progress made on the question of how to really achieve predictable outcome in other fields. So we'll get into it. So our narrative has got 3 parts, plus 1. Does anybody have a map? If anybody's seen Dear Evan Hansen, that's where we go into the theory. The second part is where theory meets practice, where we'll look at how people are estimating software. And I mean technical estimation more than project estimation, although project estimation comes in scope too. And the third part is making the map, where we try out uncertainty reduction strategies so that we can get to a better outcome. And then we'll close with this comprehensive and exhaustive review of the practice of no estimation. I got a clicker here, so I don't have to keep, there we go. So project managers and developers are really routinely asked to estimate ambiguity, such as making a fixed bid against unknown business objectives or having to make firm commitments against changing scope. And again, almost everything that I've read is about process, but process and estimation are 2 questions that are very much entwined. But if we did the best job that we could on fixing our software development process, it still really wouldn't tell us anything about what estimation actually is. So that's what I want to talk about. We find that there's a lot of resistance to estimation because of the belief in some organizations and some people that somehow the problem that they're working on is a snowflake, that it's just so completely unique that it couldn't be actually compared to anything else. And then we find a lot of resistance because of the belief that some things are simply not estimatable, right? They're not knowable, right? Some things can be, right? Happiness, right? I don't know. So we'll see if we can move past that. So we start at the beginning by going through the question that everybody goes through, is to say, what do we mean by estimate? And so I'll offer that it's a prediction of future state, when something will be done, how much it will cost, right? So not too complicated. Why do we estimate? To set expectations on when something will be done or how much it will cost when it's done. So in the end, we estimate, so we're going to achieve a degree of predictability, right? So far, there's nothing unique, but. No. So that what and why, does that work, right? About what and why we're trying to get done. So we can look at, like Webster's has got, we understand what Webster's thing is. An estimate is to judge tentatively or approximately the value or worth of something, to determine roughly the size, extent, or nature of something, to predict a statement of the approximate cost of something. So a statement of the approximate cost. So we expect that after the work is done, a statement of approximate cost, we expect that after the work is done, the actual cost is going to turn out to be different from the estimate, because we know that there's going to be these factors that we don't know about or we can't control that are going to affect the outcome. So as we estimate, we substitute these unknown or unknowable things with assumptions on what they're going to turn out to be. So for example, if we're estimating a software story that's built around an unfamiliar third-party API, we know that there's going to be risk because we don't know the API, but we don't know what the risk is going to be. So we increase the size of the estimate to accommodate the unknown. So the amount of the increase becomes an implicit component of the estimate representing our assumption about the nature of the risk, right? Our assumptions of known and unknown risks are bundled up with project work component to become our estimate, which is a discrete value, like one number, which is our supposition of the most likely outcome, right? Typically in software, it'd be time, right? To say 4 days, right? And that 4 days is a bundle of how long we think it's going to take, plus a component which we think is like going to accommodate whatever risk we can imagine. And it's bigger if we have more risk. So does that work? Right? So before we accept that view, let's ask the question again. What is an estimate, right? To appraise, to assess, to evaluate, to surmise or conjecture, to guess, what I usually do, to size up, to measure, right? So it's that last one that I really want to focus on, is to measure. So instead of thinking of an estimate as a discrete value, 2 days, 1 week, right, which is the most likely outcome, then we want to look at an estimate as measurement. We can begin to think of an estimate as arriving at a state where you know more about something that matters than you did before. So to know more about something, we first need to know what it is that we're uncertain about, so that we can formulate questions which, if we could answer them, would reduce our uncertainty. Then we need to learn how to quantify our new information so that we can apply that to our estimate. And things that we consider to be unmeasurable are simply things for which we haven't worked out what it is, what we're actually uncertain about, right? Because if it matters and we're going to make a decision on it, then there's some way to measure it. So we've revised our definition of estimation from a discrete value, which is the most likely outcome, to arriving at a state of knowing more about something than we did before. And something important about knowing more about something implies that our estimate doesn't really have to vanquish uncertainty to be valuable. It just needs to reduce our uncertainty. And the mechanism that we use to express our increased knowledge of some context of uncertainty is probability. So let's drill down into this concept of probability and uncertainty reduction, right? That's the main area. So the idea of probability uncertainty reduction was laid out in this 1948 paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication by a researcher named Claude Shannon. And this paper and the conception of measurement that it elaborated was fundamental to everything we know about the emergence of information theory and the invention of integrated circuits. So it was really a foundational paper that has gone into a lot of work that went after it. And so Shannon postulated that information is the amount of uncertainty reduction in a signal, right? Information as uncertainty reduction. So this opens up to a world of measurement where uncertain values are first-class citizens, where we can qualify uncertain values with probabilities to allow us to take into consideration intangibles, which aren't really subject to precise measurement. Our goal in estimation now is no longer to suppose how long something will take to accomplish, but instead it becomes an exercise to gather observations which will reduce our uncertainty about those things that are going to affect how long it will take to accomplish something. So the idea of measurement as uncertainty reduction opens up avenues to tackle estimation of intangibles, things that are generally held to be unknowable and therefore unestimatable. And they're considered unestimatable because we had no way of arriving at a discrete value of this unestimatable outcome. We can reduce through observations the uncertainty of what seems to be an unknown. Then if we can do that, then it moves us in the right direction, right? If we know more about something, it takes us in the right direction. And in the end, that's all we need, is to keep moving in the right direction. Because in the end, it's the best we can do. Now, before we launch into this question of estimation practice, there's another area of measurement theory that we need to cover, which is the different ways that we measure things, the various scales of measurement that we use. And mostly when we think about estimation, we think about rational scales, such as how much time or money goes into something. But we commonly use other scales to help us estimate. And it's important to know when and how to use the different scales. And you'll recognize them as we're going to them. So in 1946, it was 2 years before Shannon's A Mathematical Theory of Communication, another researcher working in a different field, Stanley Smith Stevens, published another seminal paper, which is really foundational to a lot of things. It was called On the Theory of Scales and Measurements, in which he describes a taxonomy of measurement methods. That's what his work was. And so Stevens' vocabulary of measurement scales include nominal, ordinal, rational, and interval scales, which are widely used in many fields, including computer science. You recognize them in all your computer languages. And so we need to know how these different measurement scales work. So let's quickly step through them. Right? So we have nominal scales, which are unordered sets of variables without quantitative value. Essentially, whenever you're testing set membership, including a binary set of yes, no, and having no quantitative value, you can't roll up values on a nominal scale, right? It's just information. And in our context, it's often just subjective information at that. But if it helps you reduce your uncertainty about something that matters, then it's valuable information. And I'm not going to talk a lot about nominal scale measurements tonight, but there's really some really cool things you can do with it. There's just not time to do everything. Ordinal scales are ordered sets where you don't know how much more one value is than another. So Moore's scale of mineral hardness tells us that one rock is harder than another, but not by how much. And so you can say that granite is harder than sandstone, but the scale doesn't tell you anything about how much harder one set member is than another. Right? So a 5-star rating system is an ordinal scale that's commonly abused as a rational scale. And so you'd ask the question, is watching 5 1-star movies just as much fun as watching 1 5-star movie, right? Because if that were true, that would be a rational scale, right? It's an ordinal scale. It doesn't tell you that there's no roll up, right? Ordinal scales are frequently used and they're often abused. You probably use them all the time. So rational scales are ordered sets subject to addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Time and money are rational scales. You use them every day in software estimation and everywhere else, every time you buy gas. You can roll up a group of time estimates to a single value and know that 2 times that value is twice as long as you don't take into account the mythical man month and all that. But just in terms of the math, you can do roll-ups with rational scale. Now, interval scales are a lot like rational scales. They're ordered sets subject to addition and subtraction, but they don't have any fixed zero. And they're not subject to multiplication and division, right? Multiplication and division don't work. And so the Celsius temperature scale and the intelligence quotient are examples of interval scales. Interval scales in psychology, they're everywhere, right? You see them all over the place in all kinds of different fields of math and in science and psychology and sociology. You can rely on the scale to know the difference in Celsius, for example. You can rely on the scale to know that the difference between 10 degrees and 20 degrees is the same as the difference between 20 degrees and 30 degrees. That works, right? Although it doesn't provide any meaningful reference to compare the products of various temperatures multiplied by a pair of values, right? You start doing multiplication and comparing the products, then it just doesn't give you, there's no useful information in that. And if you do it, it's just misleading, right? And in small errors, it seems like it might work, but the math doesn't support it. So that's Shannon's measurement scales. So let's review where we are. right? Our objective in estimation is to achieve a more predictable outcome. We get there by quantitatively expressed reduction of uncertainty based on one or more observations. Understanding measurement scales helps us make sense of our observations. So measurement theory is really like a mapping of the thing being measured in numbers. So now let's put this theory into the context of some common estimation strategies to get a better understanding of how it works, right? So, at this point, that's the theory presentation right there. We could talk more about the theory, but we'll cap it right at that point. This part is a discussion about how I understand people are commonly estimating software today. And there probably everybody in this room could teach me something about how they're doing it that would be useful, right? It's just from my own perspective coming out, but hopefully it'll be useful in this way. So we'll start off with estimation in the context of backlog refinement before we get into technical planning and project planning. Also, in this part, you can't really separate a discussion of process from a discussion of measurement. So when we're talking about doing this in the context of backlog refinement, that's really presupposing a whole discussion about the process of why you're having a backlog and what backlog refinement really is. But our main focus is how estimation works within that context. So we won't try to answer all those questions about process. The goal of backlog refinement is prioritization. And in order to prioritize, stories need to be broken down into units of work which are manageable, right? A couple of days, several days or less, whatever makes sense in the context of the work cycle that you're using. But something that you feel is small enough that you can commit to work, because there's no point or little point in prioritizing something that's too big to go into work if you really don't know how big it is, right? And it's a common problem in software. You put something into work that's going to take a long time, and it screws everything up. So in backlog refinement, to try to stay out of the weeds, we really need to avoid solutioning and focus on the business objective. If we get into technical planning too early, it really gets in the way of the best outcome in any case. And we really have limited time to do backlog refinement. It's not unlimited, right? You had like 2 hours to cover 2 weeks of work, would be as much as you should reasonably put into it. So we need to focus on the aspect of decomposition, just to get the work broken down into statements of business objectives that still hold up as independent and verifiable, but are small enough to go into work, so that prioritization can be done against units of work that we could actually commit to, right? So t-shirt sizing is a really common exercise. It's like a form factoring exercise that's used in backlog refinement. And to do it properly, here's an opinionated piece, is that the sizes should be considered to be on an ordinal scale. That's to say, 3 smalls don't necessarily add up to a medium, right? Medium is just bigger than small. Because as soon as you start equating the set members, medium, with rational values, like the small is a half day, medium is 2 days, you see these scales all over the place where people tell you what the equations are. Why not just use the time, right? Because now you're mixing metaphors between ordinal and rational scales. And then you kind of like, once you start thinking time, you start risking tipping over into solutioning, because as soon as you start thinking about time, you really encourage you to think about the implementation, and that can be counterproductive because you risk early anchoring on some optimal solution. You haven't really considered it fully, because you bundle assumptions about risk and complexity before you've really had a chance to explore them. And because you spend time thinking through implementation before you've determined priority. So if you stick to the goal of decomposing business objectives into stories that can go into work, estimating in greater detail than that really can become counterproductive. So there's a really strong tendency for t-shirt sizes to devolve into proxies for time estimates. So to discourage that, for those reasons, there's kind of a common practice of using Fibonacci sequence integers, which preserve the intentions of using an ordinal scale, but it makes it harder to slip into a rational conversion with Fibonacci sequence integers. So the Fibonacci sequence integers are 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, et cetera, right? They just grow exponentially. And so the fact that they grow exponentially is used as a feature of the estimation, where the exponential increase is supposed to correspond with the risk associated with your sense of uncertainty, right? Is how people use it. And so the idea is like you're sort of like you're looking at these unknown story problems, and your sense of uncertainty and your sense of risk kind of grows exponentially the more uncertain you are about what's going to happen. So you can assign these bigger and bigger, exponentially bigger numbers that are associated with it. So the relative complexity of Fibonacci sequence estimation, it lends itself to different team members using the same value to represent different amounts of work. It's really easy to fall into that under any circumstances, but Fibonacci, I think, really lends itself to that problem. And so we'll look at attempts to control that with story points, right? That's how the story points tries to rein in that kind of disassociative use. But remember first that our goal is just to work out, just to sort the work into manageable chunks for prioritization and keep the focus on the business value and avoid solutioning. So we don't have an unlimited time for the process, and we want all the team members to have a similar understanding of the scale. And so there's a simple ordinal scale that was proposed by Alistair Cockburn, right? That for me really clarifies what an ordinal scale really is about, and I find to be really effective in this backlog refinement context. And his scale has the set members Cherry Pit, Peach Cobbler, Mustang, and Brontosaurus. Okay, so it sounds whimsical, right? It is whimsical. But if you think about it, nobody in their right mind is going to try to equate how many Peach Cobblers is the same as one Mustang, right? We haven't even decided whether it's a Mustang is a car or a horse, right? Because you could be either, right? And even if there is a car for one person, a horse another, it still works in terms of what we're trying to get out of a Mustang, right? And you clearly have a single value, Brontosaurus, to indicate a story that's too big to go into work, right? And it doesn't really matter how much bigger one Brontosaurus is from another one, because neither of them can go into work. And that's really all that matters at this stage, right? If it can't go into work, you should be focusing on decomposing it. If you have enough priority on it to even think about it, you should be decomposing it into something that could go into work so you know what to do with it. So the Cockburn scale leaves really little opportunity for conversion to time, less so than Fibonacci, and it keeps things simple to keep the focus on story decomposition. Now, when story decomposition backlog refinement works, it's reduced uncertainty about what can go into work so that prioritization is meaningful, and the development team can then pull from a prioritized backlog according to their capacity, at which point the work is subject to more in-depth estimation. So now we have different kinds of estimation. We have estimation in backlog refinement, estimation in technical planning, and estimation on project planning scale, and estimation on enterprise scale. They're different. They're all subject to the same principles, but the practices will be different for each. So when it comes to this technical planning stage, then story points, I believe, has got to be the most common thing that's being used at this point. So let's take a look at how that works. I know that people use story points in backlog refinement, but I hope you get the idea that I don't think it's a very good idea, because it just pushes you too far in the direction of solutioning once you start doing that, right? Because you have to think about things too much. Just sort things into workable chunks. And then because when you're doing, if you're doing Scrum and you're doing you're planning for a 2-week sprint, you're not looking at the entire backlog, right? You're looking at the amount of work that you've pulled out of the backlog that you think that you can bring into work. And then you use story points to try to figure out whether that's the right amount of work. So story points are a unit of measure for expressing an estimate of the overall effort that's going to be required to implement a story. So it's attempting to abstract the effort from who's going to do it and really from time to begin with. And I'm sure there's a lot of different ways that teams are using story points, but the textbook method is to order your work set, your backlog, or whatever you're going to call this work set, order it by size without considering how much bigger one story is than another. So you just take the smallest story to the largest story, and you get everything like ordered, right? And then, and again, at this point, you've already made the determination that you think all this stuff is small enough to go into work. You may find later that you want to like kick some stuff out because it's too big, but at this point, you think it all can go into work. You got it ordered smallest to largest, and then you assign the smallest story a value, say 2, right? 2 would work in Fibonacci series, right? If that's what you're going to use. That's what most people use, I think, in story points. Then you assign a value to each of the other stories relative to the size of that anchor story. So you say your smallest story is a 2. So this story looks like it's twice that. So that's a 4, right? And so a 4-point story should be more or less equivalent amount of effort as a 2-point story, right? And so that's the math of story points. So, and to go all the way through it, I think a lot of teams just do that part of it, this effort prioritization, or effort scaling, that is. But formally, once that whole process is completed and the stories are all rated for their level of effort and story points, then the product owner repeats the same process for business value, where they sort all the stories by the lowest value to the highest value. They assign a number of 2 to the lowest value story, and then they rate all the value of all the other stories by relative to the base story. And then there's this complicated math that you do to figure out like the delivery value of like effort times value, all that. We won't go into that, but that's sort of the rough version of story points. And again, I understand if you do it differently, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying this is like at least the way that I'm most familiar with it. And so if it works for you, it's great, right? Because that's the main arbiter on all this, is if you got a process that's keeping you in business, then you don't have to change it for theory. But you need to be careful whenever there's this implicit conversion between interval and rational scales, because it becomes really easy to bend the outcome to what it is you're trying to get done, right? And so your local Scrum guy is always going to tell you that velocity should only ever be used internally by the team, right? You should never communicate velocity outside the team, right? Everybody says that, nobody does it that I've ever met, right? Because velocity always escapes outside the team. And so in enterprise, you have this common thing where if you have 3 teams that report a velocity of 22, 28, and 53, and you're a manager, right? You're sitting above all of this. Which team is more productive, right? That 53 team, right? Go and buy them pizza, right? But if you know what's going on with the math, right? You know, it means absolutely nothing. It means there's absolutely no information in comparing those velocities of different teams, right? Because the stories are all based differently, right? It's an interval scale. There's no fixed zero. Everything's relative. This kind of math just doesn't work, right? Now, if you have a given team, one team that reports a velocity over 3 sprints of 22, 28, and 53 over 3 consecutive sprints, does that demonstrate or prove an increase in productivity? All right. If all the stories are actually, if all the sprints are based the same, then it actually is kind of representative. But it's an interval scale, right? The idea is that you really shouldn't be trying to base the stories all of the same. From a measurement perspective, it would be better if you didn't have to think about trying to base consistently, right? But you're forced to try to base consistently in order to try to achieve this downstream metric that's based on a math that's a little sloppy. And I'm not saying it's not useful in some ways, but you really need to recognize that velocity calculations based on an interval scale are based on a sloppy math that only sort of represent what's going on and only if things are in a really consistent context, right? Otherwise, they represent like nothing, right? They could represent anything. And the thing is, they're really easy to bend the scale, right? If you're the guy that's calculating velocity and you can see that somebody wants to see a higher velocity from your team, then when you go into the next sprint, you can kind of like encourage the base story to get rebased in such a way that it'll push the scale to report a higher velocity number, even if the team's doing less work. So you can actually get negative information out of doing it in that way. So you should at least think about that stuff, right? I'm not saying don't do it, but think about what you're doing and understand how the scale works. And that way, the difference between rational and interval scales, and you'll understand why it is what you have to think about. So since our goal is improving predictability of outcome, does story points actually help you achieve that outcome, right? You could say in cases it does, but you can't say that just universally applied across all Scrum teams in the world that somehow this would be an improvement in outcome, because it's going to really depend on the application, right? And then for point value estimation, that's where you're saying that for this story, it's going to be 2 days, right? That's a discrete value estimate, a point value estimate. Is that helping you achieve the outcome, right? Because if the point value becomes a target, then it becomes counterproductive, right? As soon as you say it's going to take 2 days, and then somebody says, why aren't you done in 2 days, right? It becomes a target at that point, then it becomes counterproductive because it introduces the risk of landing on a suboptimal solution, right? Because now you're going to get it done in 2 days, even if it's not the right thing. When we look at estimate from the perspective of uncertainty reduction, the discrete estimate value doesn't do much to clarify what needs to be done. Saying that it's a 2-day story doesn't tell you what needs to be done in the story, right? It's not even clear how much of the estimate represents effort and how much of that estimate represents risk or uncertainty. For example, consider 2 stories that are both estimated at 1 week. And one story, it's very clear what needs to be done, but it's going to be a lot of effort, right? It's going to be a lot of lift. And the other story, it's really going to come down to a very small change, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what else is going to be affected. So how does the fact that the estimate is 1 week help you with one story or the other, right? I don't think much at all. So are we satisfied just to have the actual value correspond to the estimate, right? To say the actual value turns out to be 4 days instead of 5 days, or 6 days instead of 5 days, right? Or can the process of estimation improve the likelihood of actually accomplishing the task more efficiently? So let's go back to Shannon's principle of information as uncertainty reduction to see if it can help us improve our understanding of the work itself. So the first thing we learned from Shannon is to estimate in ranges instead of point values, right? Ranges are qualified by probabilities. So we have, with range estimates framed with probabilities, you don't have to commit to anything that you're not sure of, since the range and the probability reflect your uncertainty already. And so if you have no clue, then you just widen the range until it does reflect what it is that you do know. So I realize it's a little dense, so we'll drill into it a little bit here. Think about how you estimate risk. Since you can't know the exact value of something uncertain by definition, then the value you choose must be an assumption. When you make point estimates, that is some discrete value of the most likely outcome, you're forced to bundle your assumption about risk and uncertainty into that estimate value, into that single value. This makes the part of the estimate that's most likely to change with new information, right, your uncertainty or risk, it makes that the risk component, it makes it less accessible for reevaluation because you just have this one thing, 4 days, right? How much of that is effort, how much of that is risk when you come back to it. So in order to work with this, we still need a way to like bracket range estimates qualified by probability, which we do by expressing our degree of confidence in our stated range. So this is called the confidence interval, right? CI. So we'll put all these together in a second. So our confidence interval expresses the range of values in which we're confident that the actual value will fall, right? So you have a range. So instead of it being 4 days, it's, I don't know, it's 2 to 6 days. I'm pretty sure that the real value is going to fall in there, right? So, so let's work from an example. I did this first with an example in software, and then I said, let's work it from an example outside of software estimation, right?
So I'm sorry. So
yep.
We're going to pick confidence intervals that aren't typical for like academic, right? So like a CI for an academic paper, 95, 98%. If I said I had a 2-week estimate, I'd estimate anywhere from 2 minutes to 2 years to get that.
Well, you can choose the confidence interval you choose will affect the reliability of your outcome, and it will only be, how do we say? We're going to choose like 90% is probably what we want to use in software, right? 90% confidence interval. Well, let me go through it, and we'll see why it is, what the significance is of which confidence interval you choose, right? Because all we're trying to do is figure out more information, not necessarily exactly what the right answer is. So we'll go through this exercise. Say we're going to build a hangar for a Boeing 767, right? How wide does it need to be? Right? So you're an experienced developer, right? So what do? You say, I want a spike. I'm going to go out to the tarmac. I'm going to pace it off, right? That's normally how you do it, right? But if we insist on you coming up with an approximate value with no spike, then someone who's been is like familiar with doing single point estimates, and they're familiar with how their estimates are often taken as commitments, then they're going to come up with an initial estimate of NFC, right? No fucking clue. I have no idea what it is, right? You want me to say what it is? I don't know what it is. So let's help them out, right? So the first thing we do is we bracket by starting out with an absurdly wide range, right? We can say, is it less than 1,000 meters? I think so, yeah, right? How about 500 meters? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so without actually going out to the tarmac and pacing off this airplane, we're pretty confident that we can say that a 767 wingspan is less than 100 meters, right? Maybe you come up with different numbers. It's like certainly less than 100, right? Great. So how short could it be, right? Is it like it's bigger than 10 meters, right? Bigger than 20, 40, 80, right? I don't know. What is it? 40, 60, 80, 40? Okay, so 40, right? So we can start off with this estimate that the actual value will fall somewhere between 40 and 100 meters, right? And that's just it's an improvement over no fucking clue, right? And more importantly, it provides us a baseline for determining what's a useful observation, which is what we're most interested in, right? Something that's relevant to our estimate and the decisions that are in our estimates intended to drive. So that range of 40 to 100 meters represents your confidence interval, but we haven't stated what confidence interval that represents at this point, right? Your question. If you're confident that the wingspan is going to fall in that range, but we don't want your 100% confidence in interval, right? Because the actual, if you say that my confidence interval is 1 to 1,000 meters, right? You're absolutely going to be right, but that's not useful. So let's choose a lower value and also just a 90% confidence interval. And other numbers might be used in other fields. So what that means is that ideally across all your estimates, if you do this over time, if 10% of the time the actual value falls outside of your estimate range after you're done and you map them, then your confidence, your CI accuracy is 90%, right? That's a target. If your actual values never fall outside of your range estimates, then your CI is very unhelpful, 100%. If half of the values, the actual values fall outside your range, then there's not much value in your estimates. If most of your values fall outside the range, then that's not very helpful either, right? So the confidence interval just helps us stay honest about what is a useful estimate range. That's the purpose of a confidence interval. When you first try it, your range estimates are going to feel a bit arbitrary. You may have some doubts about whether the process really works. But it's because actually there's a lot of research that's done on to demonstrate the point that we're not very good at estimation when it comes down to it, right? There's a lot of in psychology especially, and the same principles apply. Estimation is a learned skill, and if you haven't practiced it in a more or less formal way along the lines that we're talking about, you're not going to be good at it. None of us are, or very few of us are. So if you've never played tennis and you find that the ball rarely lands inside the lines, then you shouldn't conclude that there's something wrong with the lines or the racket, right? Just take some lessons, learn what it takes to land the ball in the court. That's what our goal is in estimation, is not to get the numbers right, not to make some commitment about exactly when something's going to be done, but to learn how to get better at landing the ball in the court, so that we can use it to help us learn more about the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. So, so let's take another lesson, right? So you've made a range estimate and you want to try some way to validate it. So assume for a moment that your range estimate's wrong, that the actual value falls outside your range, right? You say your estimate is 4 days, okay? Now assume that you're wrong, right? Explain to yourself why you're wrong. So this is an exercise where you list out the potential problems you might run into. And in addition to improving in your range as a result, the exercise will help you develop a better understanding of the work that you're proposing by exploring the risks and unknowns, right? So you're enumerating the risks and unknowns at this, and then you adjust your estimate, and then based on the risks and unknowns, you can begin to ask questions. And if you could answer those questions, it would change your sense of confidence about where the actual value is going to fall.
Yeah, are you still avoiding solutioning? Like,
well, no. At this point we're solutioning. Yes.
Think about all.
Well, the thing is, it depends on what context you're putting it. Because if we're talking like we're doing project management and we have like a rough idea of the kind of requirements, we just have some business objectives. You're not going to be solutioning in that. There's a lot of different context with it. So you're going to apply the principles pretty much in every stage of estimation, including in solutioning, right? So sometimes when people try range estimation, they start off with point estimates. When they consider they start with considering the most likely value, and then they add or subtract to the range. 4 days, so I'll say 2 to 6. So this introduces a few problems. One of them is the risk of anchoring, where as soon as a number is stated, it's harder to move off of it. So to test for midpoint anchoring, you try testing the upper and lower bounds of the range independently and think of them as separate binary questions, right? So going back to the question of confidence interval, a 90% confidence interval means that there's a 5% chance that the true value could be above the upper bound and a 5% chance that could be below the lower bound. And so are you 95% certain that the actual value will not fall above the upper bound? You ask that question and then ask the same for the lower bound. Are you 95% confident that the actual value will not fall below the lower bound? So it's a way of revisiting your range estimate before you move on to try to just test the boundaries independently. Another technique to test your confidence interval is to test it against an equivalent bet. So imagine a carnival spinner, right? And it's got a 10% slice marked in red, and it's got 90% in green. So given the choice, would you prefer to win $1,000 if the correct answer falls in your estimate range? Or would you rather spin the dial and win $1,000 if it lands in green? Because if you choose the wheel, it's an indication that your estimate range isn't really your 90% confidence estimate range. You're more confident in the wheel. That's 90%. You know that's 90%, right? So you compare your estimate with that, and your goal is really to be ambivalent about whether you choose your estimate range or the wheel to win your $1,000. Just a technique to try to test your. So another technique, it's a little more sophisticated, but it gives you an idea what we're trying to get at, and that would be running arbitrage. So imagine that you're willing to allow your team members to buy or sell contracts that pay out if your range estimates turn out to be incorrect, right? If they buy the contract, they think that there's a greater than 10% likelihood that the actual value will be outside the range. If they go into the business of selling the contracts, they think that your actual value is in the CI. It's in the range, right? And so if the range that you specified is actually your 90% CI, then you'll feel rather ambivalent about whether people are buying or selling these contracts, right? But if you feel like more the sense of loss of everybody's buying and nobody's selling, right, then that is some kind of indication that your own perception of your own CI is not right, because there's a lot of self-pressure on not, when you say that what your range is, one of the first things that you do as developers, usually on a team especially, is you say what it is that you think the other people think that it should be. So if you're a junior developer, you don't want to say your real range because you think that that reveals your weakness as a developer, right? If you're looking at your manager, and you might want to, there's different reasons why people they lie to themselves about what their confidence interval really is. And so we just need different ways of testing it. So one of the things you probably noticed about this kind of range estimate thing is that it's all from the perspective of the estimator. We're not only trying to deduce the actual value, we're also interested in probing our uncertainty about something. We acknowledge that our estimate reflects the information that the estimator has at the time. We would expect that people with different information about the same problem would produce different estimates. So it's not a bad thing if different people on the same team or different teams produce different estimates for the same story, right? That's not a bad thing. That's fine. It's the only way to do it, because it's based on your information, and everybody's information is different, right? So what we're describing here is this Bayesian as opposed to a frequentist model of probability. So I'll avoid going down the rabbit hole, but just to go through it a little bit. If you toss a pair of dice, if it's an honest pair of dice, then the probability that you roll a 7 lies in the nature of the dice, right? Learning more about the nature of the dice doesn't affect the likelihood of rolling a 7, no matter how much you root for it. Without cheating at dice, you can't change the probability of tossing a 7. When you estimate software, gauging what you don't know about the implementation changes your perception of the confidence that you have of the probability range. That the probability range that you state will actually contain the right value, right? So you can improve the probability of your range estimate being correct by learning more about the problem and adjusting the range to reflect your new confidence about where the real value is going to lie. So Bayesian probabilities are very well suited for an iterative approach where you can improve accuracy by learning more about what matters. So if the process of estimation that you use results in a better understanding of work, the work that you're trying to do, then the cost of estimation is compensated by a more efficient execution of the work, right? You understand more about it by having gone through the process of estimation, at least in this way. So that takes us to this, this last part, which is on no estimation. Right, and so there's a few different schools of no estimation. I had a certain idea of it when I started preparing this, and I found like several different ways people are looking at it, and this one hadn't occurred to me, right? But it really is the case that that there are a lot of people out there that use the no estimation hashtag and celebrate no estimation by coming out and stating that their problem is a special case. It's too complicated to estimate. There's too many unknowns, and there's no way that anybody could possibly know this answer, right? So people that go for this are attracted to no estimation for the wrong reasons. And I hope that the whole previous part of this presentation served to demonstrate that that there's nothing that's not subject to estimation, right? Everything's knowable in this way. Not knowing how to estimate isn't a good reason to go for no estimation, right? But there's other schools for no estimation. Velocity calculation in Scrum is effectively sort of, at least it doesn't require, you can still do a full estimation process with velocity. So let's talk just a little bit about velocity, right? So velocity is, this is from this velocity calculator is on Mountain Goat software. And Mountain Goat software is Mike Cohen. It's a great resource on Scrum stuff. And the calculator is great, right? So you need at least 5 iterations before velocity is going to mean very much. So if you're doing 2-week sprints, that means you're going to be 10 weeks in before velocity is going to have any meaning, assuming that you don't have an unstable Scrum and you're actually not rebasing every time, in which case it'll take longer. So 3 months or a quarter is kind of your minimum to get a baseline. And even then, again, it's going to be inaccurate if your Scrum is unstable or your story rebasing is changing. This velocity confidence interval calculator, he uses the same principle, the 90% confidence interval, to determine down there that based on these velocities of 12, 17, 22, 18, and 24 that I just made up to say, those are my 5 sprints, and I've got 15 more iterations budgeted, then what's going to be my velocity for these outcomes? And this calculator comes back with a velocity of 18 with a 90% likelihood that your actual velocity will fall between 12 and 24, right? So it's the confidence interval. So I won't go through the description of how this stuff works. It's on his website. It's worth going through. He's got all this math that goes in and how the calculator works. So so you could in Scrum, you could no estimation in this context doesn't mean that you're not doing any estimation. It just means that you're doing a real light touch estimation, and then you're using velocity to guide whether or not your estimation is really kind of good enough, right? At least that's the way I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that's how people are doing it. It's the only way that I understand no estimation in the context of Scrum. Now, Kanban offers a really much simpler approach, which effectively is mean cycle time. So it's kind of the same principle, but now instead of doing it across iterations, you're just doing it across stories. And so as long as there's some reasonable effort that's made in story decomposition, preventing epics from going into work, right? So if you put stuff into work in Kanban, since you don't have a time box, and then it runs 2 weeks, and then you find out that you're only getting started, then you're not going to have a very good time using that in any kind of math, right? And you're trying to avoid that kind of thing anyway. Getting to no estimation in Kanban relies on the same kind of principles of having some kind of stability of throughput, right? Stability of throughput is really the basis of reducing the amount of estimation that you can get away with. And so there's this thing, this flow efficiency is called Little's law, and the line that's above the elements is the mathematical mean, right? So the flow efficiency is work time divided by lead time times 100%, and your goal is in reducing increasing your flow efficiency, right? And you just concentrate on increasing your flow efficiency, keep pushing the stories in, and because you're limiting the amount of work in progress, the theory is anyway that you can get away with lighter estimation because you're going to be if for the stories that go through smoothly, then you save the time that you would have put into estimation. The stories that get tangled up early on, right? and then you can solve them. So in any of these cases, I think that the argument that if you can see through to how the process of reducing risk through reducing uncertainty is a valuable exercise to go through under any circumstances. It's valuable to go through for the purposes of just trying to figure out what it is that you're trying to get done, right? Which is, for me, has always been the hardest part in software. So when I look at it from that perspective, then this idea of no estimation is a little questionable, right? Like, really, what is it you're trying to save by doing no estimation? The people that are arguing for it are saying the time that you're putting into estimation is wasted. Now, if you're talking about my team now, yes, I think so, right? For a lot of teams, right? The time we put into estimation, actually, we go into these meetings, we go through the tickets, we put times on stories, and then we go away, and then we come to the sprint, and we do the work, and we find that that even if we get a bunch of the estimates right, the outliers are always the troublemakers, right? And they're the ones that we needed. It's like what we needed to do was not figure out how long the easy stories were going to take. What we really needed to do was to figure out which one of the stories was going to bite us, and to figure out what that risk or uncertainty was that we had missed, and resolve those with questions, right? To find the answers to the questions that would reduce the uncertainty, to allow that one that was the problem case to turn into something that's wasn't a problem. Now, I think this is about time. There's, just to kind of conclude, because most of this was really on estimation from the perspective of backlog refinement, technical planning. A lot of that it's hard. It's maybe a little harder to apply that to project estimation. If you're looking at taking projects in as a whole, giving the client a price for a block of work, then you're kind of on a different scale, right? Or not a different scale, but you have a different way of going about it than the kind of things that we talked about here. Backlog refinement doesn't work for you. Technical planning doesn't work for you. You need a different method, right? And I'm not as familiar with the methods that are generally being used in project management, but I can say that they will come down to the same thing, is that you're going to identify the risks and uncertainties, and you're going to price according to your risk and uncertainties, right? So that you're going to make sure, to the best of your ability, that when you can give a better deal if you can actually see the thing end to end, right? And then if you can see something that looks like something you've done before, but it's got a lot of uncertainties, yeah, I've got to believe you're going to price that in. How do you do that, right? And when you do, anytime you're using discrete value point estimates, then you're bundling your assumptions in with the estimate. Those parts of the principles apply as much to project management as it does on any other level. And the way that the techniques that, the technique that we use for this is Monte Carlo simulations, right? That's what we should be talking about in this, because Monte Carlo simulations are simply the way we do math with uncertain quantities, right? So when if you have a project, you identify the 3 major risks of those projects, of that particular project, because the risk could be different for each one. You express your uncertainty in ranges instead of in points, right? You express your uncertainty in ranges, and you qualify that with probabilities, and then you try to calibrate that within your confidence interval. And then what the problem with this kind of estimation always, and obviously it's not just software, it's anything you're trying to estimate, once you start to try to calculate a number of variables, what happens, right? It just becomes impossibly complicated to evaluate all of the scenarios, right? That's where it lands. And the Monte Carlo simulations it's Fermi's gift to the world, and that is the math that we use to model uncertainty. and it's effective. And so that's the next part of this work that I need to do, is to actually develop Monte Carlo simulations that are specifically designed for this kind of scale web projects that are typical in our industry. So that's what's up next. So that's what I have. That's what's this estimation thing, right? And no estimation. So thanks for coming out, and let's have questions.
Can you start from the top?
Start from the top of like all the way through.
All the way again.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Yeah, it's going out. But this is one less. I skipped this one. This is a visualization of doing like basically this flow throughput or kind of the model of no estimation for Kanban, right? Where you model your the cumulative flow diagram shows your wait time and your cycle time, and then this cone in between tells you how long it's taking to get work through. And the theory, mathematically speaking, over time, it kind of stops mattering how big your stories are. So you can stop thinking about, as long as they're workable chunks, mathematically it disappears over time. And so then you can just start saying, you can start communicating up to your stakeholders, right, that you've got this capacity, right? And then you can and that's what we're trying to, in an enterprise, that's what we're trying to achieve, certainly, is to say, that's the main thing we need in enterprise, definitely, is to say, we need to communicate what our capacity is, because businesses up there, they've got like 1,000 times more work than we could possibly ever do. They're pushing this work down. And then you've got somebody in between that holds back and holds back and holds back, and then in a moment of weakness says something that's taken as a promise, right? That is latched onto, and then later it comes out that we don't have the capacity to actually do it, right? And so communicating capacity is like this really, really big thing. And there's a different expression for it in agency work, I'm sure, because you're on the scale of meeting the expectations of a customer within the context of a web, a project that has a beginning and an end that you can actually see.
Because for agency work, that CI is going to be everything. So, for instance, if you've got an NTE contract, you have to be able to hit those CIs really, really well during your initial engagement. But NTE is not to exceed, right?
Not to exceed, yeah.
Right.
Well, the confidence interval is, again, it's just your, that's just a mechanism to gauge your range against your belief.
If I know my team is good, hitting their 90% confidence based on previous, workloads.
Yep.
Then when I go into a project, they give me
Yes.
1,000 hours as my top end. Within a certain range, I can be confident that I'm not going to exceed that by a certain amount over a large enough piece of work.
Right. Yes.
And then internally, what I work on is not the CIs, but the deviation, the distribution of the normal.
Yeah.
Over the CI. I try to get that tightened up. I don't try to make them work faster. I just try to get them to tighten up their deviation.
Yeah. Yeah. There's not.
Awesome.
It is. Yeah. There's not. I think we're like in the beginning of the age of statistics for software management, because as far, at least in my career and my experience, it's been very much seat of the pants from small organizations to large, and there's a lot. We go through all of this painful discussion about how to do things, right? How to estimate. And I always feel like such a fool because my estimates are always wrong. It's like somehow it's a mark of me as an amateur developer because I can't get my estimates right? Because the way that what it is that I'm being asked to do doesn't really make sense, right? Which is to say, they're not really saying, give me an estimate of how long this takes. Really what I'm hearing is, I want you to make a commitment of when you're going to get this done, right? And what I want is to understand what it is that needs to be done. That's what my entire career I've been struggling with. This, everything that I face is like, I don't generally understand what I'm being asked to do, right? I get something, I'm willing, I'm enthusiastic. You know, I have an idea of what you want. If my enthusiasm gets ahead of me, I go ahead and do my idea of what they want. And then I find out how far off I was. And then if I'm more cautious, then I say, I have a pretty good idea what you want, but I really need to, we need to have a conversation about this, because I'm not really sure if what I'm thinking is what you're thinking. And a lot of those times, those conversations are hard. They're really hard to get, right? And the work is supposed to keep going forward, even though we haven't actually gone through the exercise of figuring out what it is that needs to be done. And the part that I never was trained in, I think, is how to more systematically go about identifying what it is that I don't understand, right? What actually is what I'm considering to be the unknown? And then what questions do I ask in order to, what questions do you ask if you had the answers to them? Then you would know, you would have less uncertainty, right? I always thought it was about what questions do I need the answers to, right? But it kind of opens things up to say, maybe the answers to these questions are not something that are available to me, but if I could get the answers to these questions, then I would understand more about what needs to be done. And when I do that, then it frees up the thought process to think about, not about what I think is the limits of what's available, but actually what needs to be known.
What I've been doing the last couple of years, are you familiar with design sprints?
Design, yes, sort of.
So it's not an agile sprint.
Yeah.
Sprint is completely different. I've been using those because I can never get anybody to commit to a week design sprint. Just always say on time. But what I do usually get them to commit to is at least a week of discovery. So I run deep back to a short design sprint. And part of that time I lengthen the interview process with my clients, and I take the time to ask those questions. And since we're producing an output that everybody agrees on by the end of that week of discovery, then it helps to clarify a lot of the areas where there could be confusion. Like you actually produce a mock-up, and everyone agrees that that's the mock-up they wanted at the end of the week, then that can really help to draw a line. You can't necessarily draw a line around a whole thing. So for instance, if you've got 12 months worth of work, you only spend a week doing it, you can at least draw a pretty good line around, a core set of features. Say, we all agree that that's definitely true.
Yeah.
We all saw the mock-up, liked what it did, we liked the way it worked, all that kind of stuff, even as a policy. And then from there, you can, I think some of these tools like the CI stuff, this is mind blowing for me, the CI for estimation. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You can really start to reach out and say, like, to get from here to there, there's more uncertainty, but at least I know where I started.
Right.
Right. Whereas, when I first started doing development, longer ago than I care to admit, you just pull a number out of my ass.
Right.
I don't know what you want. I'm going to write something just like you said and hope you like it. And then, of course, you're always wrong.
It's painful.
Yeah.
So other questions, inquiries, how do you go about? One part that I didn't go into a bit is the part about developing a sense of size, right? It's an exercise called calibration, right? So we do that with tools and equipment all the time, right? You can do that with people as well, right? Estimation calibration. And estimation calibration is a process by which you test. It's like the wingspan exercise that we went through, right? Where you go through a whole series of exercises and you find out where you fall, right? And chances are, for most people that do a calibration exercise with arbitrary information like that, and it's better to do it with arbitrary information. It's better to do it not to do it with domain-specific information. You don't want to do it with stuff around software and things that you're familiar with. You want to do it with arbitrary information because it doesn't have to do with the specifics of software. It has to do with how you're thinking about things, right? And for most people, when they go through an arbitrary set, like how wide is the wingspan of a 767, then the actual values will fall in their ranges maybe half the time, something like that, right? And it actually, I mean, it's almost useless, right? The guesses, right, initially. And it does very much reflect the quality of estimates that we make professionally, right? There's loads of, there's like really extensive studies about comparing domain experts against statistical methods for estimation, right? When you're predicting things, the domain experts are really valuable for narrowing things and focusing things. But when it comes to actually making correct estimates of future state, that domain experts are universally across all domains. It's not just software wrong, right? They're wrong more than they're right, right? You might as well flip a coin as accept the estimates that are provided in almost any field, except for actuarials who actually do this work for a living, right? Actuarials that's what we're talking about. It's their business. We're, in a way, what I'm saying is that we need to apply actuarial process to what it is that we do. We just need to bring it down on a level that's actually simple enough. I'm not proposing that we have like some kind of complicated change in the way we do things.
Well, but an actuary part of an actuary's job is to determine whether a data set is amenable to actuarial analysis.
Yeah, well, there's different kinds of estimation. There's estimation against data, and there's like estimation against things that you could learn. I guess it's in a sense the same thing, but a lot of the kind of estimation that we would do in software, you're never going to have a data set that you're going to be calling on, right? You're actually going to be qualifying other bits and pieces of information that you can validate in some way that are meaningful, right? It is true that if you're trying to, run a $1 billion life insurance pool, that the degree of accuracy that you need is very high, right?
They also restrict their pools to quantifiable information about which they have insufficient information to be worked. Like, so for instance, if an insurable pool drops in size sufficiently, they stop offering instruments, right?
That it is, although that's a deceptive principle in that sense, because it has meaning in a context, but it implies something that actually isn't. It's kind of counterproductive, which is this conception of statistical significance,
yeah,
right? That we all have. The idea that in order for a data set to be statistically significant, it has to be large, right? Everybody has that idea, right? But in statistics, it's a non-existent concept, right? It actually doesn't exist. There's no such thing as some kind of like statistical significance that if a data set drops below a certain point, it's no longer valid. It all just depends on what the context is that you're applying in. And the important point about that, and this is really relative to what it is you're saying, is that the less that you know about something, the less information that you need in order to move your uncertainty needle, right? Now you're talking about people that know a lot about what it is that they're dealing with, and they're trying to improve their accuracy by small percentages where they have a lot at stake, right? But if you're looking at something where it's like, I have absolutely no idea really what's going on with this, you need very little information, like maybe one observation is enough information to move your uncertainty needle. One observation, right? You could have like 5 observations, and that could be like that could be all the information that you need in order to actually commit to a decision, that variable within the context of your decision. Just a very small amount of information could be enough to say, yeah, that'll move us in the right direction to do that. And there's some math. There's a bunch of math that's behind that. It would take too long to go through that here. But there's a lot of math around how little new information is needed in order to actually support a decision that's counterintuitive to the way that we think about things. And so it's one of the things that we dismiss in software estimation is we think, we've got this thing, I don't understand anything about it, I would have to have all of this information to make a decision about it, when really all you need is, like, you have more information than you know already, right? And you need less of it than you think you do. That's a base rule of thumb.
Yeah,
Right.
I guess my point is more along the lines of applying distributions or statistical analysis to pseudo-rational scales. So for instance, like the 5-star rating thing, we've got a number, we know how to work with numbers, take means and deviations, but really that information has no value.
Right.
The numbers are convenience. It would be better to say it's apple, orange, pear.
It would, yeah, it would be.
And prevent people from doing the analysis.
Right. That's one of the problems with Fibonacci, and is the fact that it is an integer and it's intended as an ordinal.
Because it looks like a number, you think you can do numbers.
You start doing math with it, right? And
That's what I'm saying. Like actuaries, one of the things they do is they say, hey, whether or not you apply the number to this, it doesn't mean itself, or it doesn't lend itself to being analyzed.
Yeah.
Just because there happens to be a number.
And then there's, going back to the beginning, there's like this conversation around nominal data, which is just, some member of a set. And so you could say, does an API have documentation, right? That's a binary. It's actually it's a nominal scale piece of information that actually can help determine the outcome of your decision. Right, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff that it's like you can't put it in numbers, but it's pretty valuable. So time itself is not really one of the best things to work with going out. But it's all we work with mostly. My day. That's what I'm going to go back to tomorrow. Right, it's like time estimates. So my Twitter handle's on the bottom. August 1914. I put a hashtag on there / estimation. There's also # no estimation. Either one's good for contact. And my email is mgodek@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to hear from anyone for further discussions on this. Thanks. Yeah.
Just hit stop broadcast.
Oh yeah. There we go. Stop.